Welcome to the Thresholds of Reality, the podcast where we explore unexplained and mysterious events, phenomena, and legends. Today, we are joined by Dr. Christian Casey, an Egyptologist specializing in ancient linguistics of the Egyptian world. Strap in as we explore the edges of the unknown. Dr. Casey, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you coming on the show. And we find the ancient world just absolutely fascinating. Of course, there's a lot of popular media right now that surround the idea of the ancient world. What was it that pulled you into studying Egypt versus anything else you could have studied?
It's a good question. It has a kind of an elaborate answer, but I think it's actually fairly simple. So for me, the thing that really attracts me to Egypt is Egypt. Like the Egyptian art is especially appealing. I've found in my own experience, working in this field for more than a decade now and talking to people, most people kind of love or hate Egyptian art. There's a lot, you'll see things written by classicists or art historians that are sort of apologetic about Egyptian art, because it is kind of weird. You get the side view of the person's face, but then the front view of their shoulders. It's very distinctive, and on the one hand, it's sort of hyper real, but on the other hand, it's a distortion of reality in a very specific way. They don't use a lot of like perspective, things that we're familiar with from, the Renaissance onward. So it's very specific. That is definitely the reason I'm an Egyptologist, is that I find Egyptian art really appealing. And then that translates into a bunch of other aspects of what I do. So I specifically study ancient Egyptian language, and even within that, I study the way that the language would have been spoken at different times in history. So, just like English, Shakespearean English sounds very different from the way we speak today. And then if you go back further, Middle English, like Chaucer, is almost unintelligible. And then when you get into something like Beowulf, it's just a completely different language. The same is true for Egyptian. We have textual records of the Egyptian language that span 4,000 years of history. So the language changed a lot in all that time. And the things that we know best are at the end. So the most recent stages of the language we know quite well. And then as you get further back in time, the picture gets much more obscured, to the point that for the oldest Egyptian texts, we don't really have much of an idea of what they would have sounded like. So we don't really know what the spoken language was. But we have all this poetry. So we have these religious texts, especially the pyramid texts are really cool. Some of the later pyramids had text inscribed on the walls inside the burial chamber. So we have, this corpus of ancient Egyptian texts from the Old Kingdom. So these things are roughly 4,500 years old. We don't really have a clue how they were pronounced, but we can tell that they're poems. They have stanzas. They're clearly meant to be recited. And we can also see evidence that there was deliberate wordplay in that poetry. So it was meant to sound a certain way, and there are even like puns being made between similar sounding words. And we can tell that these words would have sounded similar in some cases. In other cases, we don't actually have enough information to say how they were similar, but because they're in this regular pattern where there are these very obvious puns interspersed with things that we can't quite figure out, it's kind of clear that there was something going on there.
So it's basically the Egyptian equivalent of There Was a Man from Nantucket.
Interestingly, I think this is one of my favorite things to talk about. The Egyptians were far less prudish than people in our culture. So in the pyramid text, there is the story of Atum creating the world. So when the world first began, it was an infinite cosmic ocean, right? And that's actually the Egyptian worldview has us living inside of like a bubble of air with land on the bottom, surrounded everywhere outside of that by the infinite universal ocean, which is different, obviously, from our view of how space is organized. You know, we understand that outside of the Earth there is this mostly empty space, like a vacuum with hydrogen floating around or whatever, and then other stars and galaxies and planets beyond that. But from the ancient Egyptian perspective, if you went far enough in any direction, you hit water, and that water continued infinitely after that. And it sounds antiquated, but if you actually think about how they experience the world, it makes pretty good sense, because if you're in the Nile Valley and you dig into the ground, you eventually, like if you're going to dig a well, you eventually hit groundwater. If you go in just about any direction from the Nile Valley, you eventually run into an ocean. And then occasionally the sky is blue and occasionally water falls from it. So it kind of, given the information that they had, it kind of makes sense to imagine that if you go far enough in any direction, things turn into water, and then it just becomes more watery thereafter. It also makes sense with the way like the Nile flood worked. So every year the river would flood and towns would become sort of little islands in this flooded river, and then the waters would recede again and the land would reemerge from the floodwaters every single year. So that becomes sort of a microcosmic version of creation. So anyway, back to the story. So there was the infinite cosmic ocean, and then there was a bubble of air inside of it, and then an island rose out of the water. That was the first land, and the first god, Atum, was sitting on that island. He had nothing to do, so eventually he decided to masturbate and produced. It's even weird. It gets weird. I don't know if this content is appropriate for YouTube, but this is one of the actual ancient Egyptian creation stories. I swear I'm not making it up. He masturbated, ejaculated into his own mouth, and then spat out the god and goddess Shu and Tefnut. And Shu is basically dryness, so Sho in Coptic means like dry. And Tefnut, I'm not really sure of the etymology, but it seems to mean something like, so Nut is the sky goddess, and then Taf means spit. So Tafnut is like sky spit. So
Right.
So Shu is the god of dryness, and Tefnut is the goddess of moisture. And those are the two sort of, you can tell from this creation story that those are like the two elements, the crucial first elements. And then that god and goddess, you know, got together, had babies. They gave birth to Geb and Nut. So Geb is the earth, Nut is the sky. And then Sho stands between them, separating them eternally, and that we live in the space between Geb and Nut.
So Atun was the original man from Nantucket.
Yes. Yeah. In the pyramid text, there's
okay. I see.
There's a depiction of him masturbating, and it's so great because it's in the hieroglyphs, and he has, like, I would say, an unusually large penis, and he has his hand on it, and then the other hand is just up in the air like a rodeo cowboy.
Nice.
He looks like he's really having a good time. So it's quite funny. Yeah, so I don't think it's an inappropriate comparison, because the ancient Egyptians definitely enjoyed dirty jokes, and even, like, you know, this was a fundamental part of their worldview. This wasn't even this wasn't something silly. This was how the world was created by a sort of all-powerful deity. They were just way more comfortable with those kinds of things than we tend to be.
Yeah, sure.
Sounds like it.
What was like the most surprising thing for you to come out of all of the Egyptian, you know, literature or writings that have been preserved over the years?
The most surprising thing. That's a good question. I can tell you some of my favorite things. It gets there's a fair amount of speculation in here. It kind of gets outside of things that I know for sure. One of my favorite things, I don't really necessarily expect it to be interesting to any of your listeners. So maybe this is a personal thing, but it also kind of conveys a little bit about my interest in the things I like. So there's a story called The Eloquent Peasant. And in this story, there's a man from the Wadi Natrun, which is it's like a oasis and a dry lake bed that's outside of the Nile Valley. So he kind of lives on the periphery of Egyptian civilization. He has a farm there, and he gathers up his produce and everything, and decides to head into the Nile Valley to sell things. And on his way there, there's this, you know, the villain is this kind of conniving lord of an estate that entraps the peasant. It's the silliest ruse ever. He like there's a narrow road with his field on one side and the river on the other, and he lays a cloth on the road, and then so the peasant can't take his donkey across it because he says, oh, you're gonna have your donkey stuff on my cloth. And then the donkey eats some of the grain that's growing next to him, and then so this evil lord accuses the peasant of stealing from him and has him arrested. And then the rest of the story is the peasant delivering these impassioned speeches in his own defense. And so the premise of the story, the reason it's called The Eloquent Peasant in modern English, is that this person from the boondocks who's not expected to be especially well educated is this brilliant orator who delivers these wonderful speeches. So news eventually reaches the pharaoh, and then the pharaoh writes a letter back to the judge in charge of the case, and he writes in the story, have it brought to us in writing so that we can hear it. So he asks somebody else to record the peasant's speech with hieroglyphs and have them brought to him so that he can hear what the peasant is saying. I think that's probably one of my favorite things, because it tells us that from the perspective of an ancient Egyptian who was literate, Egyptian hieroglyphs had the ability to speak to them in the way that if you read a book in English today, you can essentially hear all of the sounds of those words. As far as we know, according to modern Egyptology, that information is not preserved in the script. We have only the rough skeleton of what was written. But I take this as sort of a crucial piece of evidence that there's something that we haven't figured out yet. There's something in the Egyptian script. There's a lot of stuff that we don't know. It's you know, widely acknowledged that we don't understand why they do this way and that way. There's a ton of, there's like, for any given sequence of consonants, there's like 10 different ways of writing them, and nobody has a really good explanation for why you can write the same thing so many different ways. So I've long held on to a sort of, I guess kind of a crankish belief that there's more in the script than we've been able to extract. And that single line in this story is the thing that I would point to and say, yeah, there's more to know here. There's something we haven't figured out, because it doesn't really make sense to say that if for an ancient Egyptian, the words of the text had to be kind of imposed onto it. If the script was able to convey the spoken language so that somebody else who hadn't heard the speech would be able to hear it by reading it, then theoretically that information should be contained within it and we should be able to extract it. Which segues into an explanation of kind of what I do. So I study ancient Egyptian language. I actually use computers to study Egyptian language. So since 1822, with the decipherment of hieroglyphs, people have been working on Egyptian for 200 years, almost exactly 200 years, actually. The 200th anniversary was a few months ago. And we've made tremendous progress. We've gotten better and better at understanding the language. But I feel that we've kind of reached the limit of what we can do using like the traditional approaches of philology. So, you know, you read a bunch of texts and you kind of collect examples and try to figure things out. I don't know. I don't know if I should go into exactly what I mean by philology, but your listeners can look it up. Basically, the way of figuring things out that came out of the classical tradition of studying Greek and Latin texts. That's the way we do the study of Egyptian also. But I've tried to find new ways using computers to kind of change the way that we investigate certain questions, specifically questions of the sounds of the ancient language.
Okay.
So yeah, that's probably my favorite. That's a really long answer.
Yeah.
That's probably my favorite.
No,
my
that's fine.
favorite thing is that single sentence I read in an ancient Egyptian story. There's something else.
You know, one of the things that really kind of brings up for me is subtext, and maybe a study of subtext, which is how does culture inform the words on the page?
Mhm.
And it seems to me that it would be difficult for a student of any language to really capture the essence of the language without also understanding the culture in which it's used or in which it is formed. Do you find any challenges like that regarding kind of the cultural information or the subtext in interpreting the ancient Egyptian?
Absolutely, and not just me. I think any Egyptologist, if they're honest, will say that there are a lot of things that are difficult to understand. There are a lot of things that you have to be taught to understand. So, an example of that, kind of a humorous example, I saw a friend sent me a meme like a couple weeks ago. It was like a comparison between studying modern languages and studying ancient languages. And the modern language example was like, where is the bathroom in some, commonly spoken modern Spanish, for example, something. And then the ancient language was a sequence of hieroglyphs, and it said, Anubis who is in his wrappings. And that was the exercise sentence, which is just kind of an absurd sentence. It's not something that makes any sense, but Anubis is the psychopomp of the dead. He's the god associated with mummification. He's kind of he's connected with mummification. So the idea that you would commonly refer to this god as being in his wrappings as a mummy actually makes really good sense in an Egyptian context, but looks completely absurd when you decontextualize it. And it's excellent fodder for a meme about how studying ancient languages always means reading the most absurd, impractical sentences you've ever heard in your life. I don't have a lot of good examples prepared, but things like that are absolutely everywhere. If you're reading an Egyptian text, you're going to constantly bump into things that that would completely defy explanation if you weren't also studying the culture. I'm working on a project right now. Have a book coming out later this year that is it's aimed at like middle grade market, so like people who are in the 6th grade in the US, and it's a book that takes an Egyptian text called The Satire on the Trades and takes each section on a single page and then annotates it by adding commentary or pictures of museum objects that depict something that's being described in the text. So the text itself is this really wonderful ancient Egyptian story. A father is taking his son to scribal school, and on the way, he tries to convince his son to stay in school. So the way that he does that primarily is by systematically going through each of the common career options that existed in ancient Egyptian society, and then telling his son why each of them is an awful choice. So he talks about like a potter is always caked in mud, and people won't let him come into their house because he's always dirty, and he lives under the earth like a pig. And then, he goes through the job systematically one by one and lists kind of like absurd pitfalls that people who do that job have to deal with. And the theme is you should be a scribe because being a scribe is the best job, because basically you get to sit inside and write all day instead of having to go work out in the sun. I think my favorite is probably the fisherman. For the fisherman, he says, the fisherman is completely miserable in every way. He goes out on the river and he thinks he's going to have a great day, but he has to share his wages with the crocodiles. And then if the crocodile is unhappy because he eats too many fish, then he'll eat the fisherman instead. So, don't be a fisherman because you're under constant threat of being eaten by a crocodile, which is a little bit silly, but also like a real thing that definitely happened to many people. And then it connects to all of these things. It connects to the story of Sobek and Osiris, and really there's like echoes of this kind of silly admonition scattered all the way through Egyptian culture. But then the story is full of all these idioms, and so a lot of what we're trying to do, my co-author and I, when we're picking apart the text and adding descriptions, we're finding these weird little Egyptian idioms that on the surface don't make any sense. See if I can come up with an example. One of the examples is if you become a scribe, you'll have a good salary. It will be like a boat upon the water, which at first glance doesn't really mean anything. But if you think about it from an Egyptian perspective, you know, the Egyptian world was entirely dependent on the Nile. The Nile flooded the fields every year and deposited silt, and that's what made the land so fertile. But also it was the main highway for the whole country. I mean, probably one of the reasons that Egyptian civilization developed is because it actually had like a relatively fast mode of transportation connecting the entire country at all times. So you could rule Egypt as a king because you could actually travel up and down the Nile. The way that they traveled the Nile when going north, so going downstream, they would generally use the current to propel them. And then when going upstream, the prevailing winds in Egypt tend to blow. The winds tend to blow north to south. So in hieroglyphs, when they say to go upstream, there's a little picture of a boat with its mast down and its sail folded. And when they say to go upstream, there's a boat with its sail furled.
Nice.
Furled,
okay.
whichever way that works. Yeah. So it's almost kind of magical that you have this ancient civilization. You know, they don't have cars. They actually, until pretty late in pharaonic history, they didn't ride horses even. So the only mode of transportation is your feet. But there's this river that's almost like the perfect conveyor belt. You put your sail up if you want to go one direction, put your sail down if you want to go the other direction. And in a matter of a few months, you can actually traverse the entire country. And the pharaoh would regularly go from one end of the country to the other as a way of, shoring up his legitimacy and maintaining control of the place.
Going back to the scribe's dad, he sounds like a real boomer.
Why is that?
You don't want to work in the mechanic. You don't want to be a mechanic. You don't want to be a potter. You want to be a farmer.
That's what I was thinking.
That's basically what he said.
What job did he tell him that he should get? Did he actually tell him, or he just said everything kind of sucks?
A lawyer.
He says be a scribe, which is it's essentially equivalent to having parents today who are like, my kid has to become a lawyer. Because that's the best job to have. That's the easiest job to have, which isn't true, I would guess. But yeah, there are parents who feel that way. His dad is kind of like that. I think one of the things so this goes back to your previous question. Actually, let me go back to the boat on the water thing. This idiom. It's kind of a minor point, but it is like a boat on the water. You can imagine that because so much of transport and just the prosperity of Egypt depended on the Nile, and then trade used the Nile. So if you were a merchant, you used the Nile to move goods up and down the country where you could earn a profit. Having a boat on the water was like a symbol of success, and the very best, flashiest boats that were owned by high officials in Pharaoh were like the private jets of their day. That was the pinnacle of success, was to have a big, beautiful boat that could sail up and down the Nile. So anyway,
it still kind of is today. The bigger the boat, the richer you are, kind of the better you are.
Yeah, I not that much has changed. That's one of the really interesting things about studying very, very ancient history, especially if you can read people's words, is humans haven't really changed at all. I mean, physically, we literally haven't changed. We're physically identical to ancient people. There's kind of a popular notion that, or not even really it's often not stated aloud, but there's a kind of a hidden idea in people's view of the ancient world that ancient people were stupider than us because they didn't have computers and cars and whatever. But their brains were exactly the same as ours. They just lived in a different world than we did. And I don't know how to build a computer, so or a cell phone or something. So you can imagine if I found myself there, cell phones wouldn't be invented the next day, right? I think that's true for most people.
I mean, I can't build a pyramid or anything like that. So
yeah, I can't either. Yeah, no single person can build a pyramid as it happens. Even today, I think that would be pretty much an impossible task, no matter what your resources were, because the machinery can't really do it. But yeah, to the point about this dad being kind of a boomer. I think there's a real, and also to the point of like, are there things that are hard to get because this place is so different from what you know? The idiom is a small example, but the story is a great example because I would guess that hundreds of Egyptologists have written something about this story. Kyle can't even build his own lunch. Someone's throwing shade in the comments. But there's also an element, there's a real poignancy to the story because the father is, according to him, he works in the mines in the Sinai. So he's probably the equivalent of like a blue collar worker doing manual labor, and he's taking his son to leave him in the capital city so that his son can learn to be a scribe, and then he's going to go back home. So one of the undercurrents of the story that I've never seen an Egyptologist comment on is there's a real pathos to the father's experience of taking his son, leaving him in a place that's far away where he might not see him for years or he might not see him ever again. And he's really trying to give him all the advice he needs to succeed, knowing that he won't be there to help him. I think it's actually a really beautiful story that's underappreciated because Egyptologists just kind of look at the language or mine it for information of what ancient Egyptian culture was like and kind of forget that these were real people whose emotional experiences were totally identical to ours. They loved their children. They didn't want to live apart from them, but they also wanted them to have a better life than maybe they were able to provide all the time. So, yeah.
How long did it take you to learn, like, to understand all this? Because I mean, they're not like, it's not like words, right? It's completely different. So how long did it take to truly understand kind of what you're looking at? And
it's an ongoing process. So you could say it has been taking, I don't know when, it's 2023, and I think I started studying Egyptian around 2006 probably. So it's been almost 20 years. I still don't think I'm all that good at it, to be honest. But it actually takes a couple of years to like learn all the glyphs that you need to read something. But it is words. It's so the way hieroglyphs work, people just going into it for the first time often think that it's kind of picture writing. Like if you have a picture of a duck and a house, it means the duck is in the house or something like that. But that's not how it works. It's most hieroglyphs are phonetic. So they actually represent the sounds of the language, but as far as we know, they only represent the consonants. So they don't write the vowels. It's kind of one of the key problems with reconstructing the spoken language. You can imagine if you saw an example of an English sentence written only with consonants, you'd probably be able to kind of tease out what it was supposed to say. Some words would become especially problematic, like the word can't, for example, could be misinterpreted, but Kyle got it. So yeah, vowels can be kind of important, but the language also works differently. It's an Afroasiatic language, so it uses something called the root and pattern system, like Hebrew and Arabic, where there are vowel paradigms that correspond to like the grammatical function of a word. So it's not exactly like English, where the vowels are kind of independently free to be whatever they want to be. There's actually like a system that determines the vowels. Anyway, that's a whole other topic. But it is words, and you can learn those words. And a lot of what I do when teaching Egyptian, or even when learning it myself, is I use a lot of Coptic and I read a lot of Coptic, because Coptic is written with an alphabet that was taken from Greek. So it does include the vowels. And Coptic we can essentially speak just like a modern language. We have it I would say thanks to a paper I wrote last year, we now know exactly what the letters sounded like. And I also worked on a project a few years ago that determined the vowel sounds at a specific point in history. So we can pronounce Coptic just as we could any other language, within reason, right? It's if it's not your native language, you're not going to get it exactly right. But we know what it sounded like, and you can use that. Coptic is Egyptian, right? Coptic is just a later stage of Egyptian, written in a different alphabet that includes the vowels. So we can find words in Coptic that lasted all through Egyptian history, and then we can use that to reconstruct what they would have sounded like. It's an imperfect process, but that's also how Egyptian was deciphered. Champollion, the French scholar, he already knew Coptic, and he obtained a print from the Rosetta Stone, and then using the names of the different kings who are listed in the Greek text and in the Egyptian text, he was able to identify some phonetic signs, and then he could put those in other words that he could kind of roughly guess the meaning of by comparing the Greek text to the Egyptian. And then he determined that if you fill in some of these sounds, the word becomes quite similar to the Coptic word that has the meaning that you were expecting. That's how he deciphered the language, by using Coptic to figure out what things were. And that's the main way that we know really anything at all about Egyptian. So that's a very long answer to the question, like how long did it take you, and how is it even possible to figure these things out? They are words, and it is a spoken language. It's just a spoken language that we kind of only half know. So it is especially difficult because one of the most important aids to learning a language is being able to hear it. It's the human brain is optimized for language learning. It's especially good at doing it. But we're mostly meant to do it as children, listening to our parents and older people. So our brain is actually highly attuned to learn language from hearing lots and lots and lots of examples of that language spoken by people who already know it. We can't do that with Egyptian. So that it does make it really tricky, and it definitely means it takes longer.
So, you talked about these poems and stuff. Is this stuff that's just in museums? Is it carvings within pyramids? Is it all the above? Or how do you get access? How do you is it just pictures? Do you get to go to the museums and have to take a picture? You take it home and then you decipher it, or is it something that
they don't let you take it home these days.
No, I'm saying like a picture.
That's the trouble with museums. They never give you goodie bags when you leave.
I swear I'll bring this Egyptian papyrus back. No, I mean like you take a picture of it and you take it home and they let you and you decipher it is what I meant. But like, is that you go to the museum, or is most of it online, or?
It's a mixture of both. So I mentioned the pyramid texts, those are actually carved on the inside of the burial chambers of these later 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids. So they're in Egypt. You can actually travel to them. I've never been inside a pyramid with pyramid texts, so I'm not sure what goes into. I think you have to get special permission to go in there and take pictures. But people have done this, right? People have taken pictures. Mm-hmm. They've taken the actual text themselves and then reset that, like typeset them with hieroglyphs, either handwritten, but in nice little rows, like in a modern book, or even their typeset versions of some of them. You can type Egyptian hieroglyphs. If you go to my website, go to the download section, there's multiple keyboards that you can download for free and try out. Egyptian hieroglyphs are in Unicode, and they're still working on it, but it's getting better and better. So yeah, you can type Egyptian hieroglyphs on your computer. One of my favorite pet projects, this is going to sound completely absurd, which is why I love to tell people about it. One of my favorite pet projects that I've been working on for quite a while is an esoteric programming language that's only written in Egyptian hieroglyphs. And in theory, it should be possible to take any Egyptian hieroglyphic texts in Unicode and like run it as a script in this programming language I've been working on for a long time. So yeah, that's my weirdest thing that I'm working on. Kind of like a
Hey, at least it won't get
project.
hacked, right? You know, you can make this.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it won't ever get used, but yeah, I don't know. It's an idea I came up with a long time ago, and it was actually more of like an exercise because I work with computers all the time. But that's not necessarily where most of my academic training is. There's actually an exercise to understand like how compilers work and the different like to delve deep into why programming languages work the way they do by inventing the most useless, weirdest one I could possibly think of, one that uses Egyptian hieroglyphs. Anyway, this question is cool. Dear Christian, think they were way beyond our current technology? That's a good question.
And technology is a lot of different things. There's different areas of technology, right? There's construction technology, there's math and sciences and those kinds of things. There's travel, and so that can mean a lot of different things, right? The electronics is kind of our modern technology, and where we are now. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for electronics in ancient Egypt, but maybe I'm wrong.
So the things that always come. So yeah, there's a few ways to tackle this question. I want to kind of address it in multiple ways, but just from the outset, I'm not playing dumb. Like I know what this question is. The question is like, did the ancient Egyptians have like electric power and light bulbs? Like there's the famous question of the Dendera light bulb. So in the temple at Dendera, there's this relief on the wall. It's like this weird sort of.
It's kind of an elongated egg shape.
Yeah, it's like a weird eggy shape.
And it has what looks like might be a filament inside. Or it's like a snake, it's a snake. It's a wiggly snake, and then it actually has a lotus flower on the bottom, but it looks remarkably like, I don't know the name for this, but whatever the metal part at the bottom of a traditional light bulb is called, it looks like that setup. So people have looked at this and said, this is a depiction of some kind of like ancient light bulb. So that means they must have had electricity, and then people bring in all kinds of other things. There's the Baghdad battery is a famous example where they found these what look like Linden jars or seem like Linden jars. They're like ceramic jars with the residue of like some kind of like electrolytic solution in them, and then two like differential metals in them. So it looks like they could have functioned as Linden jars. I think people have even like built replicas and shown that they actually could deliver extremely low wattage, but if they had made this thing for this reason, it could have produced some electric power. All of these things, I find these questions really interesting. I think it's useful to ask the weird questions, because that's the only way you find out really interesting things. So like looking at the Temple of Dendera, looking at this relief and saying, hey, that looks like a light bulb. I wonder if that's like the only remaining evidence for the fact that like some especially enterprising ancient Egyptian engineer actually managed to rig up something like a modern light bulb, and then it just the infrastructure wasn't there or whatever, the tech didn't catch on, and it wasn't until 2,000 years later that we got real light. That's a fun concept. I love it as a concept. One of my main problems with that is that light bulbs don't usually have snakes in them. I feel like that's nobody who brings this up ever addresses that. And I know what they're thinking, that like, oh, it's schematic in some way, or maybe it was like the filament was made in the shape of a snake because it symbolized some kind of magical something. Like I can see an argument, but it strikes me that no one who insists that this is a light bulb ever addresses the fact that it has a snake inside of it, because most light bulbs don't. Right. Well, and then there's the other thing that you specialize in, which is linguistics, right? And stories, ancient stories. Do they ever talk about light bulbs? Do they ever talk about electricity. And, we talk about it constantly. We have ads for them. We have shows. We have like the boomer dad would say, get off your phone and pay attention. Those kinds of things show up in culture all the time. So if culture isn't talking about it, then you have to be really skeptical that such a thing existed, right?
That is the perfect way to frame the debate over these kinds of questions. So like, let me think of a typical one of these questions. I mean, if you watch Ancient Aliens, which I do, and I quite enjoy those kind of shows. I love watching.
Sure,
like,
we've had those guys on the show.
Yeah, I love it. But like, if you watch an episode of Ancient Aliens about Egypt as an Egyptologist, what always strikes me every single time about it is the stuff they're leaving out. So I would argue that if you start with a totally clean slate, like let's say you know absolutely nothing about ancient Egypt, and you turn on the TV and you see Ancient Aliens and you listen to what they say and are persuaded by it, that's perfectly reasonable because they are quite persuasive. They make a good case for the thing that they're arguing. Why experts in the field tend to dismiss those things is because they're not coming to it with a clean slate, and that's often part of their argument is that these people are indoctrinated and biased and kind of unable to get out of their own
You're
heads.
Just not open-minded.
Right. But what it actually means is that I know all the stuff that they're strategically leaving out of the shot. So with aliens building the pyramids, for example, I mean, let me be very clear. I subscribe to news about aliens. I probably see every video posted on the internet that's like someone sees a UFO. I love the idea that there are like other entities out in the universe that are like extraterrestrial anthropologists that are like floating around in the sky, and we're some like weird uncontacted tribe in the galaxy that they're just like, peeking at, maybe showing up and like deleting nuclear weapons from planes because they don't want us to hurt ourselves. Like, I love these concepts, and I'm not like I'm not a disbeliever. I think I'm kind of agnostic when it comes to those kinds of things. So like, could aliens have visited the ancient Egyptians? Of course they could have. Anyone who says they couldn't have is being closed-minded, because that's impossible to prove or disprove. You can't possibly know that. But the pyramids themselves are rooted in this huge set of traditions. I don't think I even have time in this podcast to go into all of the different things that pyramids are connected to. But we can see the evolution of the form as it starts as mastaba tombs, and then there's this kind of like layer cake style stack of mastaba tombs that's sort of triangular. That's the pyramid of Djoser. And then immediately after that, you start getting smooth-sided pyramids. And then there's Snefru's bent pyramid, where he starts building at a specifically steep angle. And then the chambers inside started to collapse because the angle was too steep and the weight from the stone was too much. So then about halfway through, they added a bunch of wooden beams to the roof to kind of shore it up. And then they lowered the angle of the rest of the pyramid. So you can plainly see that they are developing this form. And then after Snefru's bent pyramid, there's two other Snefru pyramids that were true smooth-sided pyramids, and then you get the Great Pyramids, right? So you can very plainly see the evolution of this as a form. It's connected to a bunch of ideas in Egyptian mythology, like the Ben stone. It's actually connected to obelisks, which are connected to that, which was related to a solar symbol from the Heliopolitan solar cult that developed during the Old Kingdom. So yeah, there's just connections everywhere that make this very weird thing. I mean, there's the Wadi El Jarf papyri where they describe the process of quarrying the stones and transporting them across the river, and they have lists of materials and quantities. So yeah, so there's so much stuff that they're not saying that actually eliminates the question that motivated this rather fanciful hypothesis, right? Like to adduce aliens to explain something is a stretch. And I'm someone who like will plainly say, like, the possibility that aliens exist and have visited Earth, I think it's probably pretty likely that that's true. I think that probably has happened. Von Neumann probes can cover the entire Milky Way galaxy in roughly 300,000 years. If we were to build one today, I mean, that's a pretty short time frame on a universal scale. It's pretty likely that, you know, there's life outside of the Earth and that it has interacted with us in some way in our history. But you don't need that to explain a building.
Yeah.
You know, like the building, the explanation is already there. The only way you can bring that in to explain a building is if you turn it into this massive mystery. But if you know all of the other stuff around it and how it all clicks perfectly together, there isn't actually a giant mystery. Like, people always say, we don't know how they built the pyramids. And to them, I say, like, what exactly else would we know? It feels like for people to stop saying that, we would actually need to have like video footage that shows each stone being laid, because we actually do know almost everything there is to know about how we know where the workers lived, we know what they ate, we know what their names were most of the time. We know where they got the stone, we know who transported the stone, we know how long it took. Aside from knowing like literally the sequence in which the stones were placed or the exact building methods that they used, you know, to a incredibly specific degree, we do know how they built the pyramids. We know pretty much everything you could expect to know about a building project that happened more than 4,000 years ago. We know more about how they built the pyramids than we know about how the building I'm sitting in was built, literally. So I don't know. It's you have to create that mystery in order to create the space to adduce a really elaborate explanation. But if you know the field really well, that space just doesn't exist. So yeah, do I think they were way beyond our current technology? Honestly, no. I think there were. So the first thing I want to sort of problematize, that's such an academic word to use, but the thing I want to problematize in that question is the implicit notion that that human civilization necessarily progresses from like worse to better, from less technology to more technology. That historically, that's not true. Many cultures have actually seen decreases in what we would call technology, you know, using that term sort of without defining it very well. It's happened many times in history. And the notion that I think it's kind of connected to this notion that like, oh, they were so smart and they were so cool and they did all these awesome things, some things that seem totally impossible to us now, they must have had technology that we don't have. I don't see that as logically following. I don't think that you necessarily need better technology to do more interesting stuff. And I'm a guy who uses computers in my work, and I'm one of the first people in my field to do that. I'm not anti-technology, but I just don't buy into the notion that technology necessarily makes our lives better all the time. I mean, look at the world at the end of the 20th century. It's ugly as shit now. 100 years ago, everything was beautiful and, you know, nice to look at. And yeah, construction technology has uglified our world in less than a century. Technology does not always benefit us.
Yeah, there's I would say kind of a romantic notion that things, you know, it's kind of an analog to the grass is always greener. You look back with nostalgia towards the past and either to simpler days or to kind of more fantastical or mysterious times and romanticize about what it would be like to be in those times and kind of like the scribe and his dad, you know, the dad is looking at a better life. He's thinking about a better life and trying to make that possible for his son. But it's really fascinating. I feel like you have all these really great insights because of the stories that you've either deciphered or consumed from ancient Egypt. Does that give you a sense that their life was dramatically different from ours in the ways that matter?
No, I think it was exactly the same as ours in all the ways that matter. I think it was dramatically different from ours in all of the ways that don't matter. Like these kind of trinkets that we love. I mean, I have my phone in my pocket all day long. but I don't think this thing has substantially improved my life. I think that's ridiculous. I think the things that make life rich and worth living are friends, family, hopes for the future, ambitions, a sense of purpose. All of these things are what really make life enjoyable. And the Egyptians loved life. I mean, it's often thought that they were sort of obsessed with death because of mummification and because of their elaborate depiction of the afterlife and things like the pyramids. But the truth is that they were actually they just really were in love with life, and they wanted it to continue. All of those things, mummification, the pyramids are actually, from an Egyptological perspective, the pyramids are essentially a resurrection machine. It's a big, giant, star-powered magical machine that's supposed to bring the dead pharaoh back to life in another world, so that he can create a blissful kingdom for himself and his royal court. That's what the pyramids are actually. That's what they say that they're for, in their own words. So they enjoyed the hell out of their lives, and they didn't want it to end, or they wanted to imagine that after they died, it would continue in a sort of blissful state. Have our lives improved, or were their lives different in the ways that matter? I mean, I think the fact that they loved life so much that they wanted to keep living in Egypt as it was forever tells you that it hasn't. They didn't care that they didn't have iPhones. They would have lived for eternity without iPhones. They were perfectly happy with what they had.
Yeah.
So
there's it was about 2 months ago, they uncovered some new tombs and stuff. I mean, that's got to be like exciting for your field, because now you get to see yet more. I mean, have you got a chance to look into any of that or read up on it, or?
Yeah, I mean, I read the press reports when they came out. I don't know if anything has really been published about them yet. I mean, honestly, this is kind of like a lame answer, but I'm really into texts. So like, if there were, when they find a new cache of like papyri, that's when I get super excited, because that's like more material that we can use to figure out things that we don't already understand. The same is obviously true. It's a perfect analogy. When they find a new tomb, that's more artifacts. That actually is some text. There are some texts in that tomb, but they're normally like kind of formulaic. And it's all kinds of stuff. Tomb scenes, especially. I love tomb scenes, because in Egyptian tombs, this goes back to what I was saying about how much they kind of just loved living life and wanted to keep doing it. Tombs often contain scenes of ordinary life, and they tend to be really, really faithful. In fact, if people are interested in looking at these things, the Tomb of Menna, that's MENNA, there's a virtual tour of that online. Just search Tomb of Menna virtual tour. And it's like a VR 3D thing where you can go in and look at all the scenes on the walls. And they have depictions of people like picking vegetables, people like having wrestling matches. There's one scene that I'm actually using in the book I'm writing. It's like a guy being held down and being beaten with a stick by another guy. It's in the story, actually. They talk about people being beaten for not doing their work or failing to pay their taxes or whatever. But I mean, obviously not especially a happy scene, but a real one that people would have observed. It's just covered with those. So every time they find a new tomb, that's a chance that we might see another like Egyptian window into their own life, because these things were painted by ancient Egyptians themselves. So it shows us not only what they saw, which of course is lost to time, but also how they saw it. So yeah, that's really exciting. I haven't looked at much of it yet, though, to be honest.
All right, as we come into the final lap here, I did want to show off some of your work here. So this is CaseyEgyptologist.com, and I'll post the link right here in our chat. Highlight the comment here. So basically this is kind of a collection of links to your work and your research and your presentations and other things. What are some of the highlights here?
I haven't updated my website in a little while, to be honest with you. So I don't actually know. I think so probably something people would really like is, I wrote a lot about Assassin's Creed Origins because it is, I don't know if any of your listeners have played it, but it's a really excellent depiction of ancient Egypt. They did a really great job with it. I think there's a paper in there.
Yeah, the first one here, Assassin's Creed Origins as digital and pedagogical tool. Is that what you're talking about?
So I think that's it. So I actually wrote a paper and just like put it online as a PDF, and I didn't publish it in an academic journal specifically so that I could just share it freely. I mean, one of the ironies of the current state of academia is that if you publish something, it actually makes it harder to get it to people to read, because the academic publishing industry is a parasite, essentially. Takes people's labor and profits from it without contributing much or anything of value. So instead of publishing this paper, I just wrote it and put it online. I think that's what's there on my website. And it's kind of a review of the game that goes through what it gets right and the few things that it doesn't get quite right. So, you know, for people who have played that game and are interested in digging into the facts behind it and how accurate it is, you can learn something there. And also for people who are interested in Egypt and haven't played it, I highly recommend playing Assassin's Creed Origins. I recommend it to all my students. It is a wonderful way to learn about what the world of ancient Egypt was actually like to experience. It's the kind of thing that if you study the subject academically, it takes many, many years of just engaging with this material constantly to form a mental image of what it actually would have been like to walk around in an Egyptian street. And with that game, you can do it straight away. You're dropped right in. It's really, really good. I think it's a super cool thing. I wrote another paper about it that goes into some of this, the value of this experience using like research on video games, but I published it in an academic journal, so nobody gets to read it, unfortunately, unless they pay the exorbitant fee that predatory entity charges for my work.
I'm sure your editor had a good time reading it.
Yeah, probably. Also, just FYI to anyone who doesn't know this, if you're interested in an academic paper, you can email the author directly and they can send you a copy of that paper legally. So yeah, there's a contact form on my website. So there you go.
The other thing I wanted to kind of point out that I've highlighted here is that you talked about encoding the hieroglyphics. Is that what we've got right here in this little sample? I don't know if you can see it.
Oh, that's it's just a Unicode title of a paper I wrote in grad school.
Okay. Very cool.
Yeah.
Also, you've got a YouTube channel.
Mm-hmm.
And the title of it is, this is Coptic using Greek letters. Is that what it is?
Coptic. Those are Coptic letters, but in the same way that our alphabet is derived from Greek, the Coptic alphabet is also derived from Greek.
Okay.
So they look very similar to Greek letters. Yeah, it's the Egyptian classroom is what it means. It's tanseve instrument remen keme.
Well, there you go.
It's kind of a mouthful. Yeah.
So anybody looking to learn more about Christian's studies, his research, his projects, check out CaseyEgyptologist.com, and from there you can find his YouTube channel. It has lots of different videos and courses. I think some of them are like active exercises between you and some other students, right? Decrypting or decoding text.
Yeah, you can follow along with those and learn Coptic, hieratic, and some Egyptian hieroglyphs. I think that's as far as I got so this was a COVID activity, and then once everything went back to normal, I didn't really have time to do it anymore. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff on there. Hopefully it's useful. There's also a video about Assassin's Creed Origins if anybody wants to dive deeper into that. I think it's like an hour long or something, or half an hour long. I don't know. It's super long. And
Looks
yeah.
like
There's a bunch of
looks
there's a bunch
like
of videos
several
of
them.
me. Yeah. So there's a bunch of videos of me playing the game and talking about it. I think it was like on Twitch, and people would ask questions. I would answer their questions as I played. And then there's also like a video essay somewhere that where I just kind of go through. It's like a Egyptological review of the game.
Nice.
Yeah, you can go find that stuff. It's good stuff.
Very cool. All right. Well, Christian, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your valuable time and your insight. The stories that you shared were really great. And hopefully you guys will check out CaseyEgyptologist.com and learn more about Egypt and the stories that they told. If you like our show and enjoyed this material, we'll bring more to you. Just like, comment, and subscribe. And Kyle, any closing questions for Christian?
No, I still have to absorb everything from the last hour.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I really appreciate
No,
it.
this was awesome.
Until next time, keep on exploring the edges of the unknown.